3 fans on.
Oh my god.
I need all the fans.
I need all
Alright,
the
it's
fans.
recording.
Alright, so review for Europe. Unit 1, Late Middle Ages, Renaissance. I got to sort of temper my behavior knowing that it's going out there to YouTube video land. But anyway, well, it could happen. I might have to do that. Okay, so I wouldn't get wrapped up in spending a whole lot of time looking over the early stuff on the late Middle Ages. Just basically know the reasons why England ended up with a constitutional or limited monarchy, and what are the the pieces to it, the Parliament and all that. Likewise, know how the French and why the French ended up with an absolute monarchy, and why Germany or the Holy Roman Empire didn't unite at all. I mean, that's it. Just some real basic, fundamental stuff from that. Next, the basic impact of the 100 Years' War, the plague, and the problems that the church was going through, like the Babylonian captivity, etc. And then that brings us to the Renaissance itself. Okay? And the first thing we talked about, if you recall, was the causes as to why the Renaissance started in Italy when it did, about the middle of the 1300s, in the city-states of northern Italy. Obviously, the trade had a lot to do with that and all that. One of the potential essay questions deals with that specifically. It's the one that talks about causation, that economic factors rather than social and political are what caused the Reformation to occur in Italy. Okay. And then we really, once we got done with all that, we talked about the different city-states, and we talked about how their governments on paper were supposed to work, but how they really did in practice. And then we finally ended up with 1494 as a kind of turning point, when Charles VIII of France comes across the Alps and invades Italy, and that starts that whole pattern of foreign adventures in Italy. Constant invasions. Because again, if you've forgotten, Italy wasn't united. There was a bunch of different city-states that often were bickering and at odds with each other, which made it real easy for somebody like France to come in and just do whatever they wanted. Now remember, that's going to play into the reasoning why Machiavelli wrote The Prince. Okay? Alright, then we hit the real kind of meat and potatoes of the unit, the 3 major ideas of the Renaissance: individualism, humanism, and secularism. Alright? Almost everything, you look at those essay questions, 4 of the 6 of them come directly back to those big ideas. Right? And being able to find evidence of those ideas being applied. Alright? So when you're going through, you have to be able to identify the ideas, explain what they meant when they're when Renaissance thinkers talk about individualism. What do they mean by that? Explain it. When they talk about humanism, what do they mean by that? And then provide examples of thinkers or artists and works of art.
How specific are we supposed to know, like, the artists and their works of art?
You don't need to know 35 works of art, but you do need to know a couple. Alright? I would know 2 or 3 really well. The Last Supper, the Sistine Chapel ceiling, David, things like that. Right? So that you can say, if you get a question comparing Renaissance and medieval art, you can say, okay, here's a characteristic of Renaissance art. The artist studied anatomy to more realistically depict the human body, and you can see that in Michelangelo's David because.
Okay.
All right, so you don't need a whole bunch of examples, but you need 2 or 3 really good ones that you really, really can use and explain. Okay, and you need to know about the techniques like perspective and studying anatomy. But then tied back to the ideas. Why are they doing all this? To make things more realistic. Why? Because it's important. The human form is to be celebrated. This world is important in and of itself, not just a stepping stone to heaven. So it hits the humanism and the secularism. Okay, we got into all those ideas. We talked about Petrarch, we talked about Leonardo Bruni, Pico della Mirandola. Pico della Mirandola in that Oration on the Dignity of Man is really important. He's the one that says, man's created in the image of God. Therefore, he's not bad. Therefore, since he's created in God's image, he has virtually unlimited potential. And your duty then is to seek to fulfill your human potential to the highest degree you can. And that, right there, that's the essence of what he's saying. And then how does that play out? Well, if we're created in the image of God, then the human form is beautiful and should be depicted accurately, right? So it plays out in art and in the ideas. So you had Bruni, you had Petrarch, you had Della Mirandola, and then I think the final thinker that we talked about in that setting was Lorenzo Valla, who wrote on pleasure, and then also was the guy that proved that the donation of Constantine was a forgery. Then we had the little PowerPoint thing on art, right, and how Renaissance art, what characterized Renaissance art, how it was different from medieval art, and how that connected to the ideas of the Renaissance. Individualism. Our artists signed their works during the Renaissance. They didn't during the things like that. You're not going to have specific medieval works to cite. You're just going to have to say medieval paintings tended to, not use perspective. They tended to be two-dimensional and not realistic. The human forms, figures were often positioned in like weird, twisted stances and stuff, like things like that. So, got art. You had that handout. You had the PowerPoint. All that. Okay, and of course that could be one of the questions. What were the compare and contrast Renaissance and medieval art, and then tying it back to the ideas of the Renaissance. Then we went into education, and we talked about Vergerio, Peter Paul Vergerio, and his program of education training for training leaders, civic humanism. We talked about the view that the highest fulfillment of human potential is participating in the affairs of one's community. And so that should be the purpose of education, is to train people to be able to effectively do that. Now remember, the root of all of this, every single thing, is going back and studying the classics again. The rediscovery, and that's where these ideas originally come from. But they're studying the classics to learn about human nature, not to glorify God or anything like that. So you had Vergerio. Then you had Baldassare Castiglione in his book, The Courtier. He's a century later. He's just interested in creating gentlemen. Not for any really larger civic purpose. Somebody trying to come in.
I don't know. That was a knock, but like, I don't know if they were.
I don't know if that was at this door or not.
It was a back door.
Yeah. Not for some larger civic purpose, but just for the purpose of creating gentlemen. Now, that brings to light a fundamental characteristic of Italy's approach. We focus on individual improvement, and by improving individuals, we improve society. Right? And then I think we ended up that discussion with Machiavelli and the Prince. And what are the ideas coming out of that? Well, first of all, how is it Renaissance? Because it's talking about realistic politics. This is how political system and power really work. Not how they should work, but how they really work. Based on observation, based on empiricism. And Machiavelli saying, realistically, here's how a ruler has to operate. And sometimes he has to do what unfortunately are some pretty nasty things. But remember, don't get caught in the trap that he's advocating ends justify the means as just a normal standard of behavior for people. Not at all. It's for rulers, specifically in Italy in the 16th century. Because remember, the background behind this is all of the constant warfare and invasions of Italy. Why? Because as we mentioned earlier, they're not unified. They're divided and therefore weak. Machiavelli's calling for somebody to unify Italy. He's calling for a prince to step up, take the bull by the horns and get to work unifying Italy. And that in that situation, in that circumstance, a ruler and his behavior, the ends do justify the means. Because that's the only way, he says, the only way that we're gonna be able to stop, being constantly invaded and trampled on by these foreign powers. It's better to be feared than loved. Have to learn how to act like the lion and the fox. Those kinds of things. He uses Cesare Borgia as an example. What a wonderful human being that guy was. Any Borgia. So yeah, that's where we ended up with Machiavelli. Then the next thing we did was we moved up to the Northern Renaissance. We quickly talked about the impact of printing and Gutenberg. That's huge. But I think the impact, that's pretty self-explanatory. Hey, there are more books now. Lots more, and they're a lot cheaper because it takes a lot less time and it's a lot easier to make them. And so ideas spread, right? So you get to the north. Now remember, all of the basic ideas, individualism, humanism, secularism, are shared by both the North and by Italy. But there are two key differences with the North. First, the North has more of a focus on religion. And second, thinkers in the North are interested in programs of social reform. Now this seems like a pretty good place and time to, Okay. I felt it, so I did it. All right. That way our viewers at home won't be. They're kind of, oh yeah, it's going on. Bam! What was that? Okay, so anyway, there's only really three thinkers that you have to worry about with the North: Thomas More and Utopia. Right. The idea of Christian humanism and Erasmus, and then Rabelais. It's just more Erasmus and Rabelais. There's only three.
Sorry.
Okay? Now, if you get that essay comparing Italy and the North, the way to set it up, I think, is to take the fundamental views of the Renaissance, the big ideas, say they both shared them, discuss what they are, come up with an example of an Italian and of a Northerner for both, then go on and say, okay, here's what is unique about Italy, here's what's unique about the North. Boom, you're done. Now, let me ask you a question. Out of all the Renaissance thinkers we talked about, who is the one person that doesn't think very highly of human nature?
Machiavelli.
Everybody else is like, yes, human nature is good. It's good. It's great. It's wonderful. Machiavelli's like, nah, no, it's not. Okay, and then after that, that led us to what we did today in 8A and what we'll do tomorrow, and that is the new monarchies. And in a way, these are monarchs practicing Machiavellian principles in a way, even though most of them that we talked about happened before in time, before Machiavelli wrote The Prince, which tells you that the ideas kind of were out there, right? And what you want to know is the commonalities that the different new monarchies have in common. Commonalities that they have in common. Yes, I get the redundancy award. So, for example, using the middle class on the royal councils and as government officials rather than the nobles. You want to understand how and why that alliance between the monarchs and the middle class was formed, and why the nobles were antagonistic toward it. All right? The idea of having an army that you can use, having enough revenue. They all were really, really into acquiring enough revenue, mostly to build up their army. All right? How are you going to do? They all kind of, if somebody was a dissenter or caused trouble, they pretty ruthlessly repressed them, meaning chop their heads off usually. And so you want to know what the commonalities are. Then there were three countries: France, England, and Spain. And in France, you need to know about Charles VII, Louis XI, and Francis I.
What's the last one?
Francis I. There's only one English king you need to know about, Henry VII, the first Tudor. And then in Spain, it's just Ferdinand and Isabella. And what they all did to consolidate royal power. I'm not going to go into all the details of that, because A, I did that this morning, and or B, we're going to do it tomorrow. So, do you know what we did this morning? We did the new monarchies this morning. Talk about the Inquisition and all that in Spain, and the idea that you gotta. In Spain, we really see for the first time, really poignantly, the concept that you can't have political unity without religious uniformity. So Ferdinand and Isabella said, okay, Jews and Muslims, you got to go. You're out of here. We can't have differing religions. You can be whatever religion you want as long as it's Catholic. Okay. And then, so that's a really quick and dirty summary of the major concepts of the unit.